good evening to you both. And let's begin with mounting reaction to Premier Smith keeping the door open to a vote on separation.
This is a time to unite the country, not people saying, oh, I'm leaving the country, or I'm doing this, I'm doing that.
Talk of separation is really insanity, because there is no pathway to separation. You can have all the referendums you want.
Criticism and rejection in the wake of the Premier's live address, in which she pledged to honor the process of a citizen-led push for a referendum on separation. Graham, what has the Premier unleashed with Monday's address? And do you think she struck the chord she initially set out to?
Well, I think chaos is one thing she's unleashed, because she can't explain what separation really means in this whole referendum idea. I had a column in the Toronto Star that they published today based on her news conference yesterday, where the reporters were focused on separation. Of course, she was talking about her speech or the address on Monday to the province, where she was giving demands to Ottawa and saying, you've got to listen to us. There'll be, an Alberta task force going around, the Alberta First task force going around and talking to people to get their ideas. But when we came as journalists to ask her, well, what does separation mean? How does that work? What happens with First Nations and things like that? She didn't have any answers. She said, look, it's all hypothetical at this point. And she kept saying, look, I'm a Canadian. I don't want to separate. But if citizens want vote on separation, yeah, they can have it, probably 2026. But again, we're pushing her to explain what this all means, and she couldn't. She says, look, it's all hypothetical at this point. So that gets confusing, because she's raising this major red flag to the rest of the country and then failing to explain what it actually means. And so at one point, as she was saying, look, if things don't work out with Carney and resetting a relationship with Ottawa, then we'll look at next steps forward. And then a reporter for CTV actually said, well, can Alberta actually separate? Do you think that because of all the legal issues and other things, ethical issues, and it comes to the First Nations especially, can we separate? And she says, look, I don't want to prejudge my relationship and talks with Carney, Prime Minister, in the days and weeks and months ahead. So again, she ducks the questions when it comes down to actually explaining what she's up to.
Chaldeans, as we heard in the clip a second ago, this is provoking a response with First Nations leaders, other provinces speaking out. What's to be made of the conversation this dialogue around separation is creating?
Well, I think, Michael, we learned from the Quebec 1995 referendum that pathway is very, very complex. First of all, we have the Clarity Act, which means there must be a clear question and, of course, a clear majority of Albertans will have to vote to separate. But there are issues, I think Graham was hinting at this, issues around what is going to be the nature of the economic partnership between this new entity and the rest of Canada. How do Albertans get access to tidewater, to sell resources? How do you deal with First Nations treaties, territories? And it's a very complex process. And I think that other actors in Canada, Ontario Premier, are beginning to weigh in, because they see this as potentially clouding the engagement that Canada has to have with Trump, with a new trade deal, and other threats to Canada. So I think this is essentially something that is unknown, and I think it's up to the proponent to give us more details in terms of what exactly they think with this concept of separation.
Okay, so Graham, like it or not, where Albertans are concerned, Albertans are talking about this. So how much of a factor could this issue of separation be in the Edmonton Strathcona by-election, which Naheed Nenshis is running in, and how many ever by-elections come up between now and the next few months? Does a vote on a referendum of sorts become the bottom line here?
Well, yeah, it could very well be, especially in a riding like Edmonton Strathcona, with the riding where Nenshis is nominated. That's, of course, federally stayed with the NDP, and this is the old riding of Rachel Notley. So yes, you can see the NDP using this, saying, look, an issue now is separation. The Premier's playing games with this. The thing is, polls have shown, only a minority of 25, maybe 30% of Albertans are thinking of separation. especially when the Liberals won a re-election and federally. But yeah, this becomes a really easy issue for the NDP to hang their hat on by saying, look, we're not separatists. Let's send a message to the Premier that we're not separatists. So I think that's really going to help the NDP. And it does create an issue for the NDP. And that idea, of course, you've got Nenshis saying, let's call her bluff and call a referendum on separation. There's no way the Premier wants her fingerprints on this, because I think she knows it would fail. So for the government to sponsor this, then she does look like she's undermining Canadian unity for political ends, her own ends. And also because when it fails, well, then she looks really bad. It undermines her position. So she wants to leave it to the citizens to raise this, keep her fingerprints off. But going back to your question, yeah, I think this is going to be a good issue for the NDP to rally the troops behind.
Okay, and to follow up on that, Chaldeans, and we heard from Naheed Nenshi off the top, is debate over a referendum on separation an issue the opposition wants to spend a lot of time concentrating on?
Well, I think in the short term, because it's captured everybody's imagination, the opposition has to deal with it and try to pin it on the Premier. But I think that listening to Nenshi, his major challenge going forward is going to be on policy. It's policy, policy, policy. He has to avoid this kind of personal animals towards the Premier. I mean, the personal attacks really are going to help the base. They're always pleased when the Premier is attacked. But I think Albertans are looking for the NDP to carve out policy space in areas like dealing with municipalities, healthcare reform, taxation. If the NDP produces specific policy in these areas ahead of the election, I think they will have more room. But if the leader of the party is continually on this business of attacking Smith daily, it will energize the base, but I don't think there's room for more opening for other people that want to look out for the NDP as an option in the next election.
The much anticipated first meeting of Mark Carney and Donald Trump is over and done with. And while the U.S. president maintained Canada should be the 51st state, this is how the Prime Minister responded.
Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever.
This is very friendly. We're not. This is not going to be like we had another little blow up with somebody else. That was a much different.
While the meeting stayed friendly, the trade dispute is far from over, with anticipated negotiations over CUSMA hanging in the balance, to which the PM told reporters later the two countries are now fully engaged. Chaldeans, it was certainly a meet and greet of sorts, but in terms of it being a substantive conversation, what do you take away from the dialogue, the performance in front of the cameras?
Well, I think Mark Carney passed his first test in terms of establishing some kind of personal connection with Mr. Trump. He used a mixture of flattery, referring to the Trump as a transformational leader, and also stated his policy approach that Canada is not up for sale. So symbolically, I think he passed that initial test and established a connection that was absent with Mr. Trudeau. But in terms of policy, I think nothing has changed substantively. Mr. Trump hasn't ceded any ground in terms of tariffs. Canada still has to deal with 25% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and goods that are not compliant with the USMCA. So overall, I think Mr. Carney has, gotten Mr. Trump to commit to attending the Kananaskis G7 meeting and establish some kind of personal connection. But we'll have to wait and see how things unfold with the coming renegotiation of the USMCA.
Graham, on Chaldean's point, the fact there was no movement, no breakthroughs, no concessions on the tariffs front, should Canadians have expected more from this first meeting?
I don't think so. In fact, the Prime Minister and his office made a real point of downplaying expectations. They put the bar really low. So they weren't, look, I think it was Carney quipped, there'll be no white smoke, referring, of course, to the Cardinals picking a new pope, meaning that we're not going to see some sort of new deal done in a half-hour public meeting. Of course, they're meeting behind the scenes. But no, I think they set the bar really low. They weren't expecting any sort of movement. But as Chaldeans mentioned, they got along really well. It's a big difference from what happened between the president and Trudeau, and look at Zelensky, what happened in his meeting with Trump. This is just the opening gambit, the opening moves, and it certainly is a major shift in Trump's rhetoric and his language when talking about Canada, talking about the prime minister, and not referring to Carney as the governor. So people who are critics of Carney didn't want him to win, obviously. Conservatives are taking shots at him still for not standing up to Trump. He stood up to Trump as much as he possibly could, because if you start to argue with Trump, it's going to go sideways. So I think that the bar was set low. We'll see what happens. This is going to be a long, involved process, but it got off to a good start, I would say, in that public meeting in the White House.
Chaldeans, what do you see this first meeting doing for Mark Carney back home? How does it end up playing politically?
I think politically, look, this relationship is at a low point. The outburst of Mr. Trump towards Canada has really soured that relationship. So this is a building block, and I think people in Canada are realistic enough to know that dealing with Mr. Trump is tricky. And I think the Prime Minister has started off well. He's gotten support from Mr. Poilievre. So I think it will play positively for him back home. But the policy question is where the rubber hits the road going forward. Mr. Carney, in the renegotiation of USMCA, has to address the issue of Quebec concerns around supply management, for example. Also he has to deal with some of the unraveling of unity in Canada around this separation issue in Alberta. So I think the Prime Minister has to really, be ready to deal with this engagement with the U.S. going forward. I think it's going to be a big challenge for him and a big part of his agenda.
Graham, is this the first meeting outcome the Smith government would have been hoping for? How do you see it playing politically here?
Well, you would think so, but it's not as if the Premier has much good things to say about Liberal leaders in Canada. Of course, because Smith went to Mar-a-Lago, talked to the Premier very informally, and then met with various Republicans, hoping to have the U.S. be a bit more kind, at the very least, towards Canada. That's actually happening. But it is interesting, though, when it comes to Smith's reaction to Carney. Even though she's very critical of the federal Liberals and she has those demands, basically let us get more pipelines, northeast, west, south, whatever, to get more energy out of Alberta, she did speak highly of the meeting that she had, the virtual meeting online, phone call, whatever, last Friday between Smith and Carney. And she said it was a very positive first step. She said, look, he listened to my concerns, he didn't interject, didn't interrupt, took a very respectful tone with Smith. So I think that she's saying that's positive, even though, of course, she's gone on to the threats of a possible referendum on separation. The meeting they had last Friday, it sounds like to me, Carney, in a sense, won her over somewhat, just like Carney managed to win over the president somewhat.
Chaldeans, last question to you. What kind of focus will now be put on the G7 summit in a little over a month's time, when the world leaders, Donald Trump included, we expect, descend on Kananaskis country?
Well, Michael, it's interesting. I hear there are reports that Mr. Carney gave Mr. Trump a Kananaskis golf course gift. So I think he's preparing the ground for this important summit next month. Mr. Trump is going to be here, and he has to continue that engagement with Mr. Trump. Look, this tariff issue is going to come head to head for the United States in the coming months. If we see shortages beginning in the United States, politically, it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Trump. So I think the Kananaskis meeting is an opportunity for Mr. Carney to push for some kind of a deal on tariff reductions for Canada.
All right. We have to leave it there. Good to see you both. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much, Michael. Take care.